So hello friends. So far the we are covering the third chapter, understanding experience. So this is the part 4. Let's start. Understood in this manner, the self relation to experience is ambiguous, particularly because of the domineering concept of judgment. In Indian philosophy, we repeatedly encounter the prevalent view that experience is always and necessarily tied in with an experiencer. The experiencer is the one who is aware of experience. If the Cartesian self is the capability for deliberate judgment, then this self by itself cannot experience emotion such as suffering. That is, we have an experience and the self judges it to be a particular type of experience such as humiliating, shameful, and so on. For some, then there is therefore a need to distinguish between self and subject. Steenworth suggests that what happened to us constitute only our subject and not our self. He further adds that the self is what we are left with when we distance ourselves from anything that only happens to us. So, when we suffer because of a particular experience, the suffering is a part of the subject and not of the self. One can extend this, as Steinworth indeed does, to even claim that thoughts belong to the subject and the self judges them. In this view, then the category of an individual is the sum of the self and the subject. Thus, it is the individual who acts and who feels and judges, and so on. Does experience belong to the self or to the subject? If we follow the above arguments, then it seems that it must belong to the subject. The self merely judges the experience in terms of understanding what kind of experience one has, such as the experience of shame or humiliation. It is the self that does the job of categorizing experience under these concepts. So, how these experiences are categorized under what concept depend on the self. I would argue that this formulation of the self and the subject, which has had a greater influence on the relation between experience and knowledge oblique theory in the dominant Western intellectual tradition, need to be repositioned in the context of any debate on experience and theory in the Indian context. On the one hand, there is nothing Indian or European about the self and the subject as a category. But on the other hand, one should recognize that these categories are not independent of cultural presupposition and worldviews. We should, of course, keep in mind the fact that empiricists and some contemporary philosophers would not want to make such a distinction between the self and the subject. But nevertheless, these distinctions and what follow from them have had a seminal influence on the way social science has responded to the problem of experience and its relation to theory. What role does the notion of self play in Indian philosophical theories? There are many competing philosophical theories in Indian philosophy. It should not be a surprise to note that there are many different formulations of the self in these philosophies. One major tradition which has had a great influence in talking about the self is the Vedanta tradition. The Nyaya and the Buddhist school differ with the Vedantins, with the Buddhist most famously being known for the denial of the self. But in general, there seems to have been some common element in the many different schools of Indian thought, not including the view that deny the existence of self. First of all, the idea of self is captured based by the notion of the I. The nature of the self is also closely related to the theory of body, mind, and consciousness. These theory hold. For many Indian tradition, the mind is not different from the body in a kind, like it is for Descartes and modern thought. Mind, manas, is also matter like the body. Moreover, in Indian thought, the self is always embodied. The description of self in this philosophical school are similar to that discussed above. Advaita, Nyaya, and Mimamsa are all concerned with the nature of experience, but tend to describe it in terms of consciousness. The first question that confront these philosophers is this: who perceive experience? Suppose I have a particular experience. When I say that I have that experience, does it necessarily imply that there is another self that is perceiving this experience? In the language of Indian philosopher, what they were asking is whether consciousness need another higher order seer to see the experience. In the discussion above, we consider the possibility that the self judges experience. Nyaya and Mimamsa hold a view that is closer to the description but not in terms of the judgment. For them, the self is the object of consciousness and it is available through the I experience. But for the Advaitinis, consciousness is self-luminant and is thus able to see its own functioning. The description of experiences in Advaita is influenced by its typology of three basic states defined as the waking, dreaming, and dreamless sleeping states. All these three constitute what we call a ordinary experience. In all these three cases of ordinary experience, there has to be a common subject who experience them. For if this is not the case, then we should have at least three selves corresponding to the three states. Moreover, a pure subject, an experiencing subject who is not experiencing anything, also called the self, can never be experienced. For Advaita, this pure subject is the true self, and the aim of liberation is to have knowledge of this self. To know the self, there must be an experience of the self, and this is really the problem. So Advaita accept the idea of self luminosity of the self. In all the three states, something is witnessing them all, and that is the pure subject. Our experience is never of the pure subject, but only of the subject who experiences. So our normal I is not the pure I, but only the imagined I, which is also called the ego. In general, for Indian philosopher, the ultimate knowledge is the knowledge of the self. That is perception of its true nature, whether the self is enduring or not. While Indian theories of the self often end up with the discussion on liberation, there is nevertheless an important point in this idea of the self, like the self subject distinction discussed earlier. A similar distinction of the pure subject is present in Indian views. Both the pure subject and the self are witnesses to the experience that is had by the subject. So we might say that the pure subject is the author of the experience, the one who perceives all the experience happening to the subject and thus has awareness of these experiences. In a similar manner, we could call the self the honor of the experiences that the pure subject become aware of. For the Advaitiyans, this difficulty in describing experience is part of the problem of language. As Sharma pointed out, one cannot use the words knowledge and experience with reference to the pure subject. That this is a nevertheless done only show the poverty of language, which is that language itself involve a division into subject and object. This is a reason, as Sharma suggests, for the emphasis on silence. Note here an interesting difference on the origin of the subject object distinction. For some phenomenologists, it arises as the essential nature of experience itself, whereas for Adityan's, it arises from the structure of language. Both are important insights that have some relevance to the experience theory debate. In contrast, when the Buddhists reject the existence of self, They're also rejecting an agent who is witnessing all the experiences. The Buddhist debate on the matter of self and experience actually gives a clue to the structure of the self oblique subject. If there is no self standing outside the experience, witnessing the experience, Advaitins, or judging it, Cartesian, then there must be something in the experience that is self aware. In this context, Anubhava stand for an immediate experience. Reflecting on this experience, which would include judging it, leads to higher order. Thus, the real distinction for Indian theories of experience and self is between immediate experience and conceptual experience. That is between conceptual and non-conceptual experience. I would argue that the question of judgment, which is so central to modern Western philosophy, arises in Indian thought through the consideration of conceptual and non-conceptual experience, a topic which is major debate between the Nyaya, Nyayikas and the Buddhist. Experience that is immediate and direct is not mediated by concept. I will interpret this experience as the experience of the subject. When this experience is seen through conceptual categories, then it has already been judged and determined. This constitutes the activity of the self as against the subject. For Indian tradition, even if they do not follow the self subject distinction in terms of the judgment, they are following a similar path in their debate on conceptual and non conceptual experience. These distinctions are not mere philosophical nitpicking, but have a serious consequence for the question of the relation between experience and knowledge. It is a fundamental it is of fundamental importance to issue of what kind of relation one has to one's own experience, what one can reasonably know about this experience, and so on.